I suppose that you have learned from previous lectures what is CSS flexbox, and today we are going to discuss another type of positioning in CSS named CSS Grid. Okay, on the following links you can find official documentation what is CSS Grid, and the third link on the third link you can find how browsers support this technology. Okay, to start working with CSS Grid, it's the same as a flexbox. We should create container and some child elements, and we should assign to container property display grid and define how rows and how columns will be in our layout. Grid template columns, it's the columns of our layout. The first argument, 100 pixels, means the width of first column, and the second argument, 150 pixels, this is the width of the second column. And grid template rows, it's the same. It's the width of first and second row. And grid gap property, it's free space between cells. Okay, let's continue. Okay, I said we should create container, define rows, columns, property display grid, and put into some childs. Okay, like flexbox, grid also have rows, columns, something like flex direction. Okay, in grid there are implicit and explicit cells, rows and columns. By default, if we have container with the property display grid, every item will create a row. So if we didn't define rows and columns, and okay, let's look at example. This is behavior by default. Every item creates a new row because we didn't define rows and columns. And if we changed property to column, there will be created columns. Yeah. Let's continue. Yeah, by default creates row, and if we would like to change it, we should use property grid autoflow, similar to flex direction. Let's continue. Explicit grid. Okay, in this example, we have container with display grid, spacing between cells 10 pixels, and property grid template columns. The width of the first column and the third 100 pixels, and the width of the second is 150. And here we have just 3 cells. No, just one row that we defined here, and the height of this row is 100 pixels, and every new row which we didn't define will be the another. We will have another with which connected with the content in every cell. Okay, we define just one row here, and in this row 3 items, but we have 10 items, and the height of every next row will depend on content. Okay, controlling implicit tracks. Let's look at example. So here we have also container, and with 9 items, 9 child items, and here we define just first row columns and just first row. 3 columns and 1 row with a height of 100 pixels. And with the help of property grid auto rows, every new row, the height of every new row will be 40 pixels. So let's continue. Grid lines and numbering. In CSS Grid world, numbering is often based on lines that are between rows and columns. Numbering doesn't refer to column and rows, and tracks are specified by lines surround them. This is why there is always one more line than number or tracks. These points on the screen, for example, let's speak about first item. The place where this item started, the number where this item started is 1, and the number where this item ended is 2. We will speak about it a bit later in next slides. Okay, on the following links you can find tools to work with grid. So naming lines manually. If our layout becomes more complex and grows fast, we can name our columns and rows manually, and it will help us to work with our layout, and it helps us. For example, we have a container in previous example. Every item could have these properties: grid column and also grid row. And in this property, we can define the number of starting and the number of ending. If we talk about this item, property grid column will take 2 arguments, 1 and 2. Okay, let's continue. Grid template columns, grid template rows. Each cell has intrinsic dimensions of a box. Intrinsic, the width of the box is calculated on the dimensions of the contents that the box itself contains. And to control cell sizing, we have 2 properties: min content and max content. Min content, the smallest width of a box, where the box contents don't overflow the box itself. And max content box ideal size in a given exists when given infinite available space. Intrinsic min content, max content values is what CSS Grid uses in many places under the hood. So let's look at example. Here we have one container with three child elements. The first child element has property with max content, so it's out of the border of parent element. The second element has no properties, so distributes all free space or available space. And the third container, its min content, which equal to the width of the longest word. So let's continue. What? Guys, please turn off your microphones. Don't forget. Okay, let's continue. Functions. To make our work with CSS Grid more convenient and responsive, we have functions. For example, function repeat is a function that allows to define how many times a particular track definitions are repeated. So as a result of this expression will be 6 columns. The first column width will be 100 pixels, and the width of the 6th column will be 100 pixels the same. And also for free available space will be separated by the rest 4 columns with the width 1 fr. Let's continue. Also, there is min-max function in CSS Grid. This function takes minimum and maximum size of the track. Function is greedy. It will use max possible size. And if min more will be more than max, then max is ignored. Fit content, simple function that stretches the track according to its content up to a maximum value. Function isn't greedy. Fit content with argument 200 pixels says that track should take between min and max content, but not more than 200 pixels. Let's look at example. So here we have a container with 3 child elements. And here we have 3 columns with created with grep template columns. And the max width will be 200 pixels. This we can see here. And also fit content with argument 200 pixels is equal to min-max function with these arguments. Rows and columns size units. I suppose that you already learned that there are different types of size units in CSS. For example, percent, pixels, em, rem, vm, vh, vmin, vmax, and all of them are supported by CSS Grid. So at this example, we defined to the first column the width of 100 pixels, to second 6 rem, and the third 10 view widths. Also, one important moment, try to limit usage of percent, prefer auto, fraction, or min-max, because it can break your layout. Free space distribution, auto unit, free space, containers width or height, explicitity, size, text, gaps. Okay, let's see example. Here we have a container with 6 elements, and we defined width of every column auto, and so the result will be the following. The first cell spreads to depends on its content. Auto in track definition stretches the tracks as much as possible. We'll try to set the track size based on item's max content. Auto isn't quite as robust since its size is based on the content inside. So auto is useful when combining with other CSS Grid features like FR units. FR units, FR used to distribute a slice of available free space to tracks. One FR is one fraction of the free space size. It does so by looking at what space is available in the grid container, taking away any space needed for gaps, fixed with items, or content that is defining track sizing, and then sharing out the rest according to the proportions we have specified for the tracks. So here example where grid template columns with one FR repeated 3 times is equal to this. Okay, let's have the example. So here we have one container with 9 child elements, and we defined space between our cells 10 pixels and columns. The first column width is 100 pixels, then 50 pixels, and the third column will take all available space of its container because we're using one FR. The same thing to third column. So the third column also takes all available free space. Let's continue. Equal columns, FR and min content. One FR repeated 3 times will create 3 equal tracks, but not always, because, for example, here we have content which is more than this cell, and the result will be the following. So if we define with min-max, also the result will be the following. And to prevent column from growing more than one FR, we can use min-max with the first argument 0. Okay, let's continue. FR versus auto versus percent units. Both FR and auto grid values check their child element sizes first and then sizes accordingly. Both auto and FR consume free space fractions. One FR is one fraction of the size, auto more complicated. Unlike percentages, both auto and FR values can be expanded based on the size of their internal content. So let's look at example. Here we have 3 containers. The first container is defined. The first container defined columns by percents. The second container with the use auto units, and the third with one FR. And depends on different cases. We can use different size units, but don't forget, try to limit the usage of percent. Let's continue. When FR and auto are used together, FR wins the fight for remaining space. Auto is shrinking down to the max content of its element content, perfect for sidebar layout, and min-max, and you have sidebar with minimum width at min-max, for example, with 400 pixels and 1 FR, and you have a main content with minimum width. So at this example, we have we defined 3 columns. The first cell with auto, the third cell with also auto, and main content spreads to all available space because its width is equal to 1 FR. Auto FR summary. Auto and FR can be expanded based on the size of their internal content. If soft wrap cannot be done, use with min-max for more robust, predictable behavior. To see the results of auto and FR on rows, grid height must be explicit. Okay. Let's speak about grid row, grid column, and its order. By default, grid elements take first available space in the track. This can be changed. There are 2 properties to change the order: is grid column and grid row. Grid column is short for grid column start and grid column end properties, and grid row is short for the same way. Sizing with grid column and grid row has syntax start, stop. Start and stop can be used to more element and they refer to line numbers or line names. Also, we can use span to specify spanning. For example, grid column span 2. And if spanning is greater than number of columns, then implicit columns are created. So here we can find example of code, and this property indicates the order of this item. And best practice, using negative numbers can be helpful with media queries. You can redefine grid columns and rows. Using negative numbers or named lines reduces number of changes needed. Okay, order property always to reorder elements. If one item has order, then all other items must have the order specified as well. By default, all items have value null. Let's look at example. So here we have container with display grid and also 6 items here. But the order of these items is changed. So we changed order of the 6th child, of the 5th child, and just div. And as a result, we have such order. But it's better practice to use property order because it breaks our accessibility and text selection. So, for example, our code stays the same, but in view we have another order, and also it makes accessibility. Okay, let's continue. Dead spots. Grid column and grid row. When placing and sizing elements, we can have dead spots. If item is too large, it will drop to next row and leave dead space. So like this and like this. Setting grid autoflow.
I'm sorry, your
Yeah.
presentation is not shown. We can't see
Oh,
your presentation now.
okay. Thank you. Do you see my screen?
Yeah, now I can see.
Okay, let's continue. Dead spots. And setting property grid autoflow dense enables algorithm that tries to organize cells in a way that minimizes number of empty places or dead spots. Items with explicitly set grid column, grid row are ordered, placed first, and then others are laid out. So let's look at example. Okay, here we have a container and 12 child elements. So we defined columns. Each column have width of 100 pixels, and in this expression we said that every third child will have the width of every third child will take 300 pixels. So like this, and like this, and like this. And it causes dead spots, free spaces. But if we use property grid autoflow dense, so we have such a result. And sometimes it could be helpful. So let's continue. Also, best practice: don't use it or use it with caution because it also breaks accessibility and text selection. Template areas. Template areas are friendly names to pieces of the grid. Think of layout first. there are two properties: grid template areas. Grid container defines the layout areas, and grid area, grid cells define to which area they belong. So let's look. Here we have parent container and 5 child elements. First of all, every element we assigned property grid area to each element of our layout. To the first element is title, to the second left, to the third right, to the fourth content, and to the fifth footer. With the help of property grid template areas, we defined what spaces will take each element of our layout, and we see that first element will take all the whole first row. The second element takes left. The third element takes right, and the fourth element takes content, and the last takes a whole last row. Okay. Template areas and grid lines. When template area is defined, additional named line names are created. Footer start and footer end. Let's look at example. So here we also have parent container and 5 child elements, almost the same grid template areas properties. And also, when we defined grid template areas to the fifth element, we can use property grid column with such naming, which is connected to content, which is in our grid template area, but it will be equal to second and second. So it's the second column, and in these expressions we talk to our browser display the fifth element starting at second column and ending at second column. Okay, let's continue. Template areas and media queries. Used with media queries, it's easy to change how layout looks by changing grid template areas. Okay, let's see the example. So here we have also container with 5 child elements. Okay, and with this property, we defined that if the max width also not max width, and the width of our device will be less than 500 pixels, our layout will change according to this. So the element 2 and element 3 will not display, and as a result we will have so let's have a look. Yeah, just we see just first, fourth and fifth elements. Okay, let's continue. Responsive grid, repeat, autofill, autofit. Responsive layout, it's an approach to web design that makes web pages render well on a variety of devices and window or screen sizes. The purpose of responsive design is to have one site but with different elements that respond differently when viewed on devices of different sizes and features. Media queries are useful when you want to modify your site or app depending on a device's general type, such as print versus screen, um, or specific characteristics and parameters. Um, okay, Flexbox and CSS Grid are responsive by default with the use of units, size units auto FR or function minmax. These specifications were written in a world where responsive design and supporting multiple devices was already a thing. They reduce the need to use media queries. And why CSS Grid Flexbox are better? Media queries work in context of the screen size, whereas Firefox CSS Flexbox CSS Grid work in context of the container. So let's look at example. Here we have two layouts. The first layout has no wrapper. Yeah, right. The first layout has no wrapper, and the second layout has tag div with class wrapper. And so here we have this result. Okay. Best practice is trying to limit breakpoints and media queries. It's better to use CSS or CSS Grid or Flexbox features. Responsive grid with repeat, autofit, and autofill. The magical media query-less responsiveness is achieved using the repeat function and the auto placement keywords. Difference between autofit and autofill is visible only if there are more space in the track than item occupy. Autofit adds new item to grid, fill with more empty items. Autofit stretch existing items so that they fit whole space. Um, Together with repeat, it allows to specify dynamic number of columns depending on how much space is available. And min-max function, it allows to set a range of min-max width of the item. Okay, let's look at example. So container 3 we don't use. Here we have two examples of using autofit. Oh no, we needed container 3. So here we have 3 containers. The first container defined by grid template rows and repeat autofit with the fixed width of cell, 150 pixels. Container 2 defined by grid template columns, repeat autofit and using function min-max with min with 150 pixels and max with 1 FR. So as a result, we will have cells which takes all free space because here we defined one FR. And the behavior with using autofill will be not the same, and cells will not spread it to the all available space. Okay, let's continue. Centering, justifying, alignment, and absolute positioning. Flexbox made is easier. Grid makes it even more fun. Two categories. So we have two properties. Justify items, justified content, justify self. Justify works on horizontal axis. Justify items set on container, specify how items content is justified, and justify content set on container, specify how extra space between items is distributed. Sometimes the total size of your grid might be less than the size of its grid container. This could happen if all of your grid items are sized with non-flexible units like pixels, and justify self set on item override. And the same works with line, but on vertical axis. Okay, let's look at example. Here we have a container with 9 elements. Okay, and here we have properties justify items start, align items start, and justify content and align content space between. So we have such results. If we remove it, okay, if we remove it, will be such a result. And if we remove it, we have the same result as at beginning. Okay, something like in flexbox. Absolute positioning of grid items. Position absolute removes an element from the flow of the document, so it's ignored by other elements. Works for grid items, set position relative on grid container and z index on grid items. Position in it in relation to its specified grid column and grid row start and lines. And lines. Useful if you want to overlap grid items without disrupting the grid's auto placement algorithm. Use case: hover effects on parts of the grid or grid cells, gutter background color. Alternative: multiple items in the same grid cell. Grid is good at rendering overlapping elements with no need to use position. There can be multiple elements placed inside the same cell. If you set the same grid column, grid row, you can have a hover effect on individual grid items. Just make a grid item, a grid 1x1, and place 2 items inside. If there are multiple cells that are positioned in the same spot, they overlap, and that index comes into play. This is a good solution for 1x1 grids. For bigger grids, use position absolute. So here we have example. Yeah, here we have a container and 9 items. All these items includes CSS Grid 1x1. Yeah, it's one element in this grid. It's a div with grid 1x1, which contains image and button view. So if we hover here, we have this button. Okay, let's continue. Flexbox comparison. Grid can do things. Flexbox can do. Flexbox also can do things. Grid can do, and also they can work together. Content first versus layout first. So here we can find two examples with the usage of Flexbox and CSS Grid. We can do almost the same things by in different ways. Flexbox has slightly better support and but more slide bugs. Flexbox has better animation support and Grid consistently between browsers. Browsers shipped Grid layout in a very complete and interoperable way within a short time of each other. Easy to reverse order of items in Flexbox. Grid doesn't have a reverse feature. Easy to create toolbars layouts in Flexbox with element that takes whatever is left. For example, Flex 1 or margin left auto versus grid template columns auto, 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 1FR auto. Perfectly centered, equally easy. Variable with on each row, better flexbox, flex wrap. Grid will require plenty of manual spanning and still not perfect. In one line, longer text. In second line, shorter text with flexbox column direction. This is easy. Better layout rendering performance with CSS Grid. And Grid reduces number of wrapper elements, additional helper markup. Okay, when to use Grid? A grid has strict rows and columns. Changing the size of an item in a cell, in a row or column will change the size of the entire track. If instead you want individual items to expand within a row without respecting what happens in the row above, that's a flex layout. Comparison to CSS frameworks. Fixed size layouts like Bootstrap 12 calls had their time. They helped in times of floats, and we didn't have to do percentage math manually. With CSS Grid, all math computations are done for you with autofill, autofeed, far, auto, and so on. Don't strive to use and find CSS framework with grids in mind. CSS Grid is simple. Writing vanilla CSS is easy. Each framework, Bootstrap, Semantic UI, have their own grids, layout patterns, often hard to grasp, customize, and use. Use pick frameworks with other thing in mind, like components they offer. Support they underline source is what controls things like text to speech and the tab order of the document. Create a semantic and well-structured document, then apply CSS to create the layout where we desired. Order or grid out of flow dense might cause issues, as with any reordering techniques, flexbox, absolute positioning, screen readers follow order in source, not the visual order. Also, tab order will not be changed. Be very aware of the possibility of content reordering, and check that you have not disconnected the visual display from the document order. Other supported browsers, Internet Explorer 11. Don't wait until old browser die. They won't. Internet Explorer the 11th is used mostly in enterprises, tankers, awkward mobile browsers, developing countries, Asia, and don't use display Serbic subgrid. This is level 2 and not implemented yet. Okay. Grid also used for image gallery, blocks, toolbars, auto and FR units. All the flexbox is used more often. Widgets, calendar, slider, overlay, or games, Monopoly, Tic Tac, and so on. Albums, movies, product catalogs, applications like CodePen, JS Fiddle, and so on. Responsive websites with a hint of media query and redefining grid template area, making whole page layouts with template areas, and forums rigid grids like Bootstrap with 12 calls often make it difficult to achieve the results. Thank you for attention, and I will leave the link to this presentation in chat. And also here in this presentation, you can find all code examples and links for browser supporting and so on. That's all. Have a good day. Bye.
You too. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye
Hey,
bye.
goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Cheers.
Thanks.
Bye, thanks.
That's all.